Good evening, everyone. My name is Steve Edwards. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Politics here at the University of Chicago, and we're pleased to have all of you with us tonight for another in a series of conversations that we're hosting throughout winter quarter in our series, America in the Trump Era, as we seek to understand the incoming administration and its impact on politics, policy, and the presidency. Tonight's event with Raj Shah will include audience questions, as is the case with our IOP events. We ask that when we move to audience questions that we give initial priority to our students in the audience, of course. We'll also get to others of you in the audience as we put a microphone out for people to post questions from. We ask, as we always do, that we keep your questions short and to the point so we can get to as many of you as possible. And that we also ensure that we honor the multiple points of view in the room by keeping those questions, in fact, questions. So with that preamble, let me also give you an update on a few other things happening at the Institute of Politics over the course of the next couple of weeks. Next week, we will be welcoming our first fellow here in winter quarter, Matt Bai, an award-winning journalist, one of the most thoughtful chroniclers of politics and the media as well, will be, in addition to a seminar he'll be leading on Friday the 27th, on Thursday night, the 26th at 6:15, we'll be leading a conversation with David Rhodes of CBS News, Jeff Zucker of CNN, and Anne-Marie Lipinski, who many of you may know from her time as editor-in-chief of the Chicago Tribune, now heading up the Nieman Fellows Program. They'll be looking at media coverage of the 2016 election and the impact of media on our politics today. That will be at 6:15 next Thursday night here on the campus of the University of Chicago. The following week, we'll also have a conversation with J.D. Vance. Some of you may have been signed up for that with Alex Kotlowitz. Alex and J.D. have had to reschedule to Friday the 3rd of February, a conversation about J.D. Vance's book, Hillbilly Elegy, which has been widely reviewed and acclaimed, his memoir about his life growing up in rural Appalachia in Ohio and Kentucky. That'll be on February 3rd. And then I want to just highlight a second fellow in our series. Jackie Calmes, the esteemed New York Times correspondent, will be with us for 2 weeks at the end of January and beginning of February. She's going to lead a couple of seminars and a few big public events that will focus on fiscal policy, healthcare, and trade, examining the impact that a Trump administration will have on those policy areas, what their priorities are, what the agenda will be for the administration, how Congress and both parties will respond in kind to those priorities. So Jackie Calmes coming up at the end of January and the beginning of February. You can find out about all of this on our website at politics.uchicago.edu. So with all of that business out of the way, let me turn the microphone over to Michael Sitver, who is a second-year student from Connecticut, majoring in political science here at the University of Chicago. He's been active in a number of organizations throughout campus, including the IOP, and he's currently a major player in the College Republicans. Please join me in welcoming Michael to the podium to formally introduce Raj Shah. Michael.
So today I'm very proud to welcome Mr. Raj Shah to the University of Chicago. This program focuses on the role of research in our politics, and if anyone is eminently qualified to speak on the subject, it is he. A native of Norwalk, Connecticut, and a 2006 graduate of Cornell University, Mr. Shaw is the outgoing research director and deputy communications director for the Republican National Committee. This cycle, Mr. Shaw led research efforts against Secretary Hillary Clinton, releasing in-depth reports on everything from her immigration plans to her foundation to her emails. Prior to this cycle, Mr. Shaw worked twice in the Bush White House and another 3 times for the RNC, including during the 2012 presidential campaign. In a recent interview, he remarked that his experience in 2012 taught him exactly what not to do in the 2016 election. Clearly, his efforts this cycle were successful because in a few days, Mr. Shaw will begin his 3rd tour of duty in the White House, this time as Deputy Assistant to the President, Deputy Communications Director, and Research Director. So, without further ado, my fellow nutmaker, Mr. Raj Shah.
So put this in. All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to the University of Chicago and the Institute of Politics for hosting this event. And thanks both Steve and Mike for the generous introduction. So I'm here to talk about opposition research. And before I get into it, I think it's important to define exactly what is opposition research and what it isn't. And in the most basic terms, OPPO, we like to call OPPO, is deploying information, right? Research is information, and it's OPPO research is information on your opponent, right? Now it can be deployed in many of ways to serve all sorts of purposes, but it has one goal, which is to define your opposition along your terms, and if you're doing it right, that's on negative terms. So how does it work, right? Opposition researchers, we gather, analyze, and leverage information. We gather it from public sources, only public sources, news articles, tweets, videos, public records, court records, anything that's in the public space, and that universe has expanded dramatically with social media in the last few years and the last few election cycles. We don't peddle in unverified rumors and innuendo as a matter of practice. When you work for a campaign, when you work for a political organization, that stuff is a no-no. And I want to also stress we don't gather information through illegal means or unethical means, because there's a lot of that going on, and that's just not part of what we do. And when we obtain information, we analyze it, and a lot of people think that there are like clever apps or cool tricks to synthesize mountains of data. There's none of that. There's tons and tons of young folks like yourselves, 20-somethings working out of basement offices at the RNC and elsewhere that are going through this information, doing the spade work, and it's tedious, it's long, but it's very important. Building out databases, investigating matters in a thorough and complete way that is very necessary but very tough. And I've done it for years, the Lord's work over there, and it's highly beneficial if you do it right. And then we get to deploy the information against our opponents, which I think is the fun part. And somebody like myself in a campaign or a political committee will take a piece of information that's been put into a digestible format, and then we make a decision about what's the best way to deploy it, right? It could be pitching it on background to a reporter so they could write a story. It could be putting a piece of video in a TV ad. It could be send it to Trump Tower for a tweet, right? Whatever kind of creates the most damage for your opposition, frankly, is the goal. So we have to decide what's the tactic, right? Now, from my experience, and it is a limited experience, there have been campaigns going on for generations on both sides of the aisle, but I believe successful campaigns have to have a very well-funded and empowered research operation that serves functionally as an information clearinghouse for a campaign. I think research should drive and frame paid media efforts, both positive and negative, your mail pieces, your TV, your digital efforts, all of it. I think that research should frame what your door knockers are using as scripts when they knock on everyone's door, when your phone bankers are calling. And for me, research, especially in this media age, has to drive your communication strategy, both the long-term agenda and the bit by bit, day by day, which is taking over more and more of what we do. I do want to talk a little bit about accuracy for a moment, because I do think it's very important, and something that people don't really realize in kind of this age of blogging and tweeting, that stuff kind of flies around, that when it comes from a political organization or a campaign, it has to be credible. And reporters, people, producers, everybody who digests this stuff, they're getting dozens of press releases, there are hearings going on, there are live events, etc. They are looking for a reason to ignore you. And if you give them one, i.e. you spread stuff that's not credible, that's a pretty good reason to ignore you, and you become irrelevant. And so, we go through a painstaking process reviewing our material before it's sent out, particularly stuff that's kind of the deeper dive investigative work that we do before we hand it to reporters to make sure that it's bulletproof. We murder board this stuff. We have people come in and try to pick it apart, and we ensure that it's going to be effective and at least at a very minimum taken without a grain of salt, taken at face value. So accuracy with reporters and other people who digest this news is extremely important. With that said, there's a cottage industry of self-appointed fact checkers out there who believe that it is their role to determine the veracity of political arguments. I don't have a very high opinion of them. And I'll say that I think not all fact checkers are bad. The PolitiFacts and your Washington Post fact checker and all these groups out there. But I think what they're trying to do is take political argument and boil it down into a black and white, accurate, inaccurate box. And I don't think that really works. And for people who care about the process of politics, which I do, we should seek an informed debate. And I think what these fact checkers are trying to do is try to shut down debate. And so I could get into it more and more, but I really do think that so-called fact-checking organizations that claim to have sort of a monopoly on the truth are really just replacing subjective opinion for a claim on facts. Obviously, it's a bit of a pet peeve of mine. But let me get back to research. Opposition research has really evolved with technology and media. Like so many other facets of the campaign, it's not unique. I actually remember talking to Rick Davis, who ran John McCain's campaign in the primary. He used to say, "Oh, you knew when a press person was coming down the hallway because you could hear their pockets jingle." They always carried like a roll of of nickels back then, right, to use the payphone. And the only thing they cared about was the front pages of major newspapers and the 30 to 60-second segments on nightly news. That was all they cared about. That means that your communications team was focused on a very small volume of content driven mainly by print news. Today, it's totally different, right? We have a 24/7 mobile-friendly, video-based news content system with a very fractured media landscape. You don't have three big news organizations dominating everything. So what we need to do to make research-based information gain traction is entirely different. Our primary needs with Oppo is to turn content into stuff that is quickly releasable, is shareable, and that can drive a message in an online space and in other spaces and do it all accurately and in real time. The shelf life for communicating an effective message has gone from several days to several minutes. And if you miss your window, it's kind of gone because the sheer volume of content between social media and all these cable news channels and blogs and everything else, the sheer volume that's flowing through means you really don't have another opportunity. I just want to tout the RNC for a bit and what we built over the past election cycle and in the past before that. A few anecdotes. I mean, our unofficial YouTube channel, which only carries negative videos about Democrats, which we don't pour any money into, and we kind of built an organic audience around, generated 13 million YouTube views. That's not a ton. This is all last year. That's not a ton for a campaign election cycle, but I think it is a lot when you compare it to kind of comparable, partisan-driven news outlets and organizations. A lot of people on the right came to us for their news and for their video content. That's an environment where you have super PACs, you have everything from the Washington Free Beacon and the Daily Caller and all these folks also putting up the same videos, the same content. And obviously video is not the only medium we work in. Our research department built a very big investigative unit that did a lot of work. We filed over 550 open records requests with federal, state, and local institutions, all seeking Hillary Clinton-related records. We went through 60,000 records, and that led to several hundred investigative stories in major news outlets, every major television news station, online publications, regional media, you name it. A lot of the things you saw were driven by a unit that was sending FOIA requests out every single day. As the nation's grown more partisan and news has grown more partisan, so have our Oppo efforts. We customize information because Breitbart News is not interested in the same thing as the Huffington Post. But we're able to do that because we have just a sheer volume of information that allows us to customize things for different news outlets. So what Michael mentioned about the 2012 election cycle, we learned a lot of hard lessons in 2012 because we didn't plan, we didn't staff, and we didn't resource the Oppo effort early enough and adequately enough, and we paid a big price for it. Prior to 2012, Democrats led by David Axelrod, the Obama campaign, American Bridge, which is a liberal super PAC, they built a narrative around Mitt Romney as being wealthy and out of touch, and they did the legwork behind it before he even entered the race, let alone became the nominee. I thought it was unflattering at times. It was maybe unfair at times, but it was brutal and it was effective. And the research that they leveraged against Mitt Romney came in all formats, right? They came from SEC filings about companies that Bain Capital owned, or video of him making gaffes, or of his elevator, right? And consequentially, exit polls on Election Day showed that many Americans trusted Romney more on a host of issues, but on the biggest question, who cares about you? He lost overwhelmingly. I think the split was 4 or 5 to 1, and that was decisive. So we were simply outgunned because at the RNC, we barely staffed up the effort until 2012. We didn't have, as I said, adequate staffing, adequate resources, adequate anything. And in 2016, we were determined not to make that mistake again. So after the election, myself, other folks on the Romney campaign, the RNC, came together and formed a group called America Rising that was built, kind of modeled a bit off of American Bridge and did some other things. And our goal, one of our missions starting out, was to build and develop the most comprehensive and earliest investigation against a presidential candidate in history. Our mission was to look under every rock, pursue every promising lead, and develop an arsenal, really, a mountain of research that could be deployed with speed, using all appropriate platforms, and have the accuracy that's required to be effective in today's media environment. We had an added strategic factor. There was a very clear front runner on the Democratic side. And we actually had our situation mirrored it was the exact opposite of the Democrats' situation, in the sense that they had 17 candidates they were running against. And I guess not least likely, but one of the least likely candidates to win the nomination actually won it. And I remember, if we filed a few FOIA requests to the Department of Energy, we'd get like an energy reporter would call and ask what we're doing and this and that. And I would, talk with them and find out, what are the Democrats doing? And they would say to a T, like, no one's filed anything on Donald Trump's whatever, his businesses, personally, whatever he's done. They had plenty of Jeb Bush stuff, which is pretty, useless. And, it wasn't until like December, January, February of late 2015 going into 2016 that they even got into the game. And I think that was a big advantage we had over them because, this stuff takes time. And whether it was through, lack of resources or just luck, we kind of had this strategic advantage that was built up over time. And I could just go into a little bit of some of the things we did. In 2013, we had researchers digging through every single donor to the Clinton Foundation. We would look at, corporate donors and personal donors, see, their backgrounds. We would review when they made donations. We'd compare it to lobbying records. We had this massive checklist that we would go through for every single one. We were doing this in 2013, 2 years before you saw any stories, kind of a torrent of stories about foreign influence at the Clinton Foundation. We were planting the seeds for that, years in advance. We were placing FOIA requests in the mail for all the speeches that Hillary Clinton gave to public universities, including Bill Clinton's speeches, where we found copies of these contracts, outlandish and lavish demands, restrictions on media access. I remember one of them, her press people were demanding that the president and the president's wife at a university wear a matching tie and dress, and other kind of ridiculous anecdotes. We were all over Clinton's book tour, when she said that she had not driven a car in decades, and nobody else was watching that. And she was going to be the nominee 2.5 years later, but we were able to engage at the time. And these targets weren't random. We were also testing lines of attack against Hillary Clinton, again, well before she entered the race and before the 2014 election. And with independent voters, we definitely saw that the attacks that you saw and the narratives that stuck were the same things that existed years before. It was built around character, right? Trustworthiness, unethical conduct, being a Washington insider who was wealthy and out of touch, stuck. I mean, it worked. We also learned what didn't work. Questioning her competency and her readiness didn't go very far. I actually thought we had a good case to make on that front, but we didn't really explore it all that thoroughly because voters just weren't really buying it. I remember one example that really stuck with me. We were in a focus group in Columbus, Ohio, and there was a woman who was a big Clinton fan walking in, and she saw a video clip of her interview when she started a book tour where she claimed to be dead broke because she was struggling to pay for mortgages for houses. And I remember she had this visceral reaction, right? She was like, houses, plural, and she was angry. I mean, this woman left pissed. And, it told me that this was a candidate running in a kind of change election as the first female candidate. And she was, prior to the campaign, even talking about being, this historic candidate. And we knew right then and there that she was going to run into headwinds trying to make a case for change, and that she was going to be easily branded as the status quo and as a symbol of what so many voters in America hate about Washington, D.C. It wasn't going to be hard. Let's see. So I think that with the planning and the resources that we had at our disposal, we built out this game plan, and it was highly effective. I do want to talk about one specific area. I'll just do a little test case on the stuff that we did that can kind of show why planning and doing this years out was so effective. One of the things we did at the RNC was we filed a bunch of FOIA requests, as I mentioned, and then we filed suit with the federal government, sued under the Freedom of Information Act for various records with the State Department, with the U.S. Agency for International Development. One of the things we uncovered were emails between senior Clinton staffers at the State Department and USAID talking about how in the wake of the earthquake in Haiti back in 2010, this devastating earthquake that killed thousands of Haitians, in the middle of telecommunications breakdowns where there were no landing strips to get planes into this ravaged area, that emails were being sent to senior Clinton aides, and they would identify FOBs or Friends of Bill, and these people would be sent to the front of the line on emergency response contracts, on just getting VIP landing strips to tour the area. Stuff that usually is done with a phone call was being done over open email and government email and in a place that you could FOIA. That was unusual. It was kind of a smoking gun in our minds. And we handed that stuff off to ABC News. They were impressed with it, and they put their investigative team on it, the Brian Ross team, and they do their whole thing with the unit. And they sent a film crew down there. They interviewed witnesses. They went through the procurement process, and it was a very complex investigative report. It broke in September or October. I don't remember exactly when. It got a ton of media attention. It drove a lot of conversation. Trump campaign and the candidate jumped on it, and it was a question about pay to play in the Clinton Foundation at one of the presidential debates. Now, if you look at all the steps that it took for that to happen, right? In 2013 and 2014, researchers who are investigating are saying something in Haiti doesn't look right. You know what I mean? And we are overlapping that with, okay, here's our org chart that we've kind of reverse engineered to the State Department. Here are the staffers, here are the staffers there. These are the names of the people we want to FOIA, right? We send the requests in the mail. Of course, the State Department doesn't reply. We have to sue. The whole process takes months or years. It's not possible if you get started in January of 2016 or when she becomes the nominee. I think we filed suit in March of 2016, having done so much work previously. So that's a perfect example of something, and there's so many of them, where the years of, I would love to say that I'm like some genius that figured all this stuff out. Of course, I'm not. We just were able to get a lot of resources, a lot of time and planning, and we're able to be very effective. So a lot of what you guys saw over the course of the campaign, was years in the making. I think it was highly effective. And I think that's why, in a day and a half, we're going to have a President Trump rather than a President Clinton. With that, I'll just open it up to questions and let folks ask.
Thanks very much for being here and for sharing that. So I'm interested in to what extent you have researchers who are dedicating efforts on your own candidates within the RNC, sort of in preparation for things that the researchers on the other side could uncover and then would launch as attacks.
Not a whole lot, because, frankly speaking, doing that, we'd run into the same problem that the Democrats were running into. There's 17 candidates, right? And it's highly inefficient, and it's a difficult job. And on top of that, that's not really the RNC's job. The RNC has a research shop that focuses on opposition research. We will support the nominee, and we put together some things that would, okay, here are lines of attack we expect to come on Donald Trump, and as a result, here are things you can push back with in Hillary Clinton's record, and help them prep for some of these lines of attack. But candidly, no, we didn't dedicate anything remotely close to the amount of resources that we did for the other side.
Hey, so I'm wondering, you talked about how the people get their news in increasingly partisan ways. People are increasingly just looking to what they already agree with, and you said lots of people were watching that video, the anti-Democrat video on a channel on YouTube, and you said they were getting their news from that. So how do you feel personally about contributing to an increasingly partisan climate?
I don't know if what I'm doing is necessarily making the environment more partisan. I think that we have a divided country, and I think that we have technology which allows people to get news from so many different places, and they're going to get news from where they want to get news. I don't see necessarily a downside in that. I do think that there's a sort of a double-edged sword to everything. There are so many more diverse news outlets, and yes, there are more partisan news, but there's also just more news, right? You used to have a time where, what the president of the news at ABC, NBC, and CBS wanted to show would dictate what tens of millions or hundreds of millions of Americans thought, and that's not really fair either. So I think it's I don't really have an opinion on it, frankly. I just think we have a mission. I have my mission and my beliefs and views, and we work within kind of the media platforms and political media as they exist.
And if you don't mind, I actually would love to ask a question as well. So you brought up 2012, and I'm just interested in,
Sure.
This was obviously a uniquely negative election, right? As far as in looking to the future and even looking at the past for examples, do you think that having such an opposition-driven campaign against someone who isn't Hillary Clinton, who didn't have all of those obvious things that you mentioned that you could attack, do you think that if you did put in the couple years into 2012, do you think there would actually be the content there that would be able to drive the election the way that it did?
Well, the honest answer is we don't know, right? We didn't really explore it. I mean, there was no FOIA program. I didn't know that they were handing out favors in Haiti until we knew they were handing out favors in Haiti, right? There are obviously a lot of predetermined narratives, but then we had to build the script out. We had to actually find the stuff that reinforced that information. Whether it was videotapes of her as Secretary of State saying in closed-door meetings things she would never say in a union hall in Ohio. But finding that tape, I didn't know it existed. You know what I mean? So could we have done that in 2012? Should have tried. With the amount of money that's spent on politics, I think an effective Oppo operation in a presidential campaign is a drop in the bucket, and it's entirely worth the investment.
Hey, could you talk a little bit more about the timing and strategy of when to release certain news, or if you go through certain organizations to release certain stories?
That's an interesting question. There's no rhyme or reason, most of the time, I want to say, because, we'll be sitting on information and then something happens and it just provides a perfect news hook, and that's when we deploy it. I'll give you a good example. When the email story broke, right? We had people that had gone through the State Department's Foreign Affairs manual, and I called them up and I said, what from this manual is going to put her in a tough position because of this email arrangement? We got this standard form here and this thing there and whatever else. And these 3 or 4 documents that every State Department employee is supposed to sign. And we just threw those out there, and we're punching every State Department reporter, every Clinton embed to ask those questions, and that was the time to do it. There was no other time to do it, right? Who cares about some standard form, right? Until you run afoul of the public records laws. So that's a good example there. Sometimes there's news that works for a partisan outlet. Sometimes, there are a lot of times when I just want to throw something in a TV ad, and that's I don't control the campaign's budget, so I make a recommendation and they can take it for what they want to do with it. I would say that the investigative stories that we did lots of them, they take a lot of time. These like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, they vet these stories, they do their own reporting, and we really can't control the timeline, but those give you the most bang for your buck.
Thank you for being here. I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit about the shifts that you've seen over your career in terms of what's really effective Oppo and what you think is shifting going forward in terms of social acceptability, things like that.
It's a good question. Really effective Oppo fits a narrative. With Hillary Clinton, again, it was a target-rich environment. But like I mentioned, the stuff about, we had documents declassified that undermined things she was saying about how she handled embassy security and other matters, and no one cared. No one. They're Hillary Clinton's qualified, of course. She's the turnkey president, which I strongly disagree with, but that's what voters felt. And so, focusing on the things that reinforce. If you step back for a second, a media cycle has so many things going on. Right? And there's only so much bandwidth they have to cover the presidential campaign and cover each candidate. If you can fill that void with content that reinforces things that they don't like about Hillary Clinton, you've won the day. And anything that does that, now with Barack Obama in 2008, it was his experience, right? Whether he was too liberal. Those sorts of things were more effective. I don't think anything was terribly effective, but those were totally different issues and different narratives than what you would plant with Hillary Clinton. So. Depends. It's very specific to the candidate.
Hi. Your ability to research Secretary Clinton was predicated on an assumption that she would become the candidate. To what extent did you consider other candidates that might have declared candidacy before the point that those announcements were made?
Right. That's a good question. So I always thought she was going to run. When I was at America Rising, there was a running bet, and somebody else that worked there had to buy a round for everybody at some point. But other folks that were in the mix, Bernie Sanders kind of was, Martin O'Malley was. We always had we weren't digging into their backgrounds as much as we had a big video tracking operation. I don't know if you guys are familiar with video tracking. Put a camera in the folks' face. When they go to campaign events, we would always hit anybody who could potentially run any of their events. And they were campaigning down ballot in 2014 with everyone. And so when Bernie, Martin O'Malley, Jim Webb went somewhere, we would always videotape it. And then, just when there was a news story that broke or like a good opportunity, I mean, just as a matter of sport, we would throw a hit out there, and claim a scalp if we could. But the focus was on Secretary Clinton.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. So 2012, 2016, something my husband and I talk about all the time, we keep asking ourselves, privileged white male, Mitt Romney, Donald Trump. So from our research, with your research hat on, can you talk about, from in a capitalistic society, Mitt Romney was apologetic. He was a privileged white male who did well, gave away his money, philanthropic, great experience with the Olympics, used his leadership, blah, blah, blah. Donald Trump, privileged white male, did well with what he had, created jobs. So what's the breakdown there? Can you talk about that?
Well, I mean, I have my theory. How about that? I think that Mitt Romney was very defensive about his success, right? I think that he made a strategic choice to apologize for and, to not own, the tremendous success that Bain Capital had. And that was a mistake, I think. And, so when you're put in this defensive posture and you don't kind of own it, right, you're kind of left, kind of hiding, essentially, hiding the ball and not talking about your primary qualification. One thing about Donald Trump, and he did the best in areas of working class white voters where Mitt Romney struggled, right? And he did well because he sold success. I mean, he sold it hard, right? I mean, he was extremely, that was central to his message, right? I've built this business, I know how to do this. Whether it was, fixing government or cleaning up, corruption in Washington, I bought and sold politicians, right? He owned it, and he didn't shy away from the argument. And I mean, voters bought it because I think it was authentic.
Hi, my name is Matt Enlow, and I'm a second-year student at the law school.
Hey, Matt.
Presumably, a large portion of your time at the GOP was spent directing opposition research against political opponents. How will your job as White House Research Director be substantively different from your job as Republican Director of Research?
Well, it is dramatically different. And I would say this, that I haven't even stepped into the job yet. I'm sure a lot of things will change over the next few weeks. But when I started off saying that research is information, my job at the White House will not be opposition research. It's going to be, pushing a message driven by research, driven by facts, driven by policy, driven by other things. So there'll be a big positive component to it in selling the agenda. And so communicating that is a whole different bucket that is, it may require a similar skill set to some degree, but it's a totally different application.
So Donald Trump several times said that Hillary Clinton had a classified email that not addressed, and she should not run for president because of her criminal behavior with her server. Is it a result of opposition research, or this is his own opinion that never was supported by opposition research?
Well, now we're moving into like a law enforcement question, right? I'm not a lawyer, and I don't want to speak with authority about whether or not she violated the law, but I think she did. I think that if you read the statute in question, it's pretty black and white. And whether or not people would people would prosecute that case is maybe a separate question. But I talk to people with clearances that have worked in government, and they're like, you don't do that. I mean, that's just like taking your stuff off-site to a server in your home in Chappaqua is just ridiculous. And the sheer volume of classified material, with an understanding that there's a separate classified system, and she used that as well, but the sheer volume when you're Secretary of State, just through the nature of your job, of classified material that goes through your email is a lot, and to be so reckless and careless, I mean, shows a disdain, I think, for national security protocols. I mean, you're not taking this stuff seriously, and I think,
My question
yeah.
is opposition research give him this information that he delivered to American people, or this was his decision personal that sometimes he doing his tweets and he delivered it to American people? This is my question. I understand.
Well, I mean, making the judgment that she shouldn't be allowed to run is his judgment, right? And that's, no one's going to say. I mean, if the Constitution has qualifications for running, and 35 born in the United States, right? And so,
But the fact that it's potentially criminal was given to him by opposition.
I mean, it was given by the fact that there was an active FBI investigation for months, right? I mean, I think for over a year. So, I think it was.
But FBI said that she is not criminally charged.
Right. Yeah.
I want to go back to your opinions about fact-checking, if you could expand upon those and kind of why you believe they stifle discourse.
Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned, it is a pet peeve of mine. I deal with these fact checkers, these so-called fact checkers all the time. I think, and I think that they are the same way oftentimes with liberals, and I don't think it's entirely partisan, although I think some of them probably are left-leaning, but I'll step back from that. I think you can make a political argument that is factual and have two arguments that are in diametric opposition that have facts supporting them, and it seems like the fact checkers are determined to declare one of them correct and one of them misleading no matter what. And it's frustrating because they seem to be applying a lot of subjective criteria. I think, like, in a perfect world, the notion of fact-checking seems like a perfectly innocent and smart idea. But the way it's applied, I mean, I've had conversations with fact-checkers where I'm like, okay, look at this thing that Josh Earnest just said at the White House press briefing. This is inaccurate. And they'll be like, I'm not interested in that. That's a black and white thing. I like to get into the meaty policy areas. And it's like, oh, so I like to, like, apply my opinion to the matter and say that your source is not correct because I don't like it. You know what I mean? Like, that's fundamentally what's going on. I mean, I've had situations where, PolitiFact Wisconsin says, you can attack this person based on a budget vote because it's Paul Ryan's budget, but PolitiFact North Carolina says you can't attack Obama's budget based on a budget vote because, budget votes are just planning documents and they don't have the force of law. It's like, well, where are you getting this from? You know what I mean? There's not even a uniform standard. So it's a combination of sloppiness, political bias, arrogance, and incompetence, all in this swirl of fact-checking. So that's my thought on it.
So in this particular election cycle, we saw, I think, very publicly two pieces of sort of raw Oppo data dating back to the primary period. So in WikiLeaks, there was some segments of Hillary's speeches seemed to be from an internal sort of Oppo document on herself. And then the BuzzFeed article, obviously, was some sort of private Oppo that had been conducted during the primary time of the season. From your perspective as someone who works with the party, can you talk about the type of control that you might assert in Oppo or that your organization asserts in sort of local races and also in the primary period, and also what you think, based on these sort of raw data leaks, could be the exposure associated with compiling large amounts of Oppo?
There's a component that I don't want to get into, which is kind of RNC security procedures and cybersecurity issues. But we're careful, right? I mean, if I email XYZ investigative reporter, like, that doesn't stay in my inbox very long. And we're very diligent about that. And I don't know if that helped us at all or not, but the DNC was not, and they paid a price for that. And what was shown was, obviously very damaging. With respect to local races, I mean, we don't tend to get too involved. The RNC itself is a presidential campaign and White House directed operation. It's either opposing the White House, trying to claim the White House, or defending the White House. We have Senate campaign committees, or a Senate campaign committee, a House campaign committee, an RGA, the Republican Senate Leadership Committee that does state house races. So,
just as a quick point of clarity.
Sure.
Specifically, the BuzzFeed document seemed there was some suggestion that it had come out of research that was being done among the Republicans.
Yeah, I mean, so the story behind that is that some donor hired an intelligence operative to build this dossier with all sorts of wild and salacious stuff. I mean, it's not verifiable for a reason. You couldn't hand something like that to a reporter and have them verify it. It's just chock full of rumors, essentially. So we deal in part in fact-driven public information because it can be independently verified and written about, and also because you move into this murky area where you're using practices. I mean, we have strict protocols. I don't let my staff dumpster dive. You know what I mean? Like we stay above board because the blowback for going in a certain direction, especially when you're a Republican, to be totally honest, is a lot worse than anything you'd gain from going in that direction.
Thank you. 3 years ago in this room, Reince Priebus discussed the technology investments that the RNC was making. Were you able to apply emergent technologies in terms of some of the data collection, the distillation, and the analysis in this cycle that may have been different from opposition work you've done in the past?
I wish I could say we did a ton of that. I mean, there is some stuff with video collection that allowed us to transcribe and transcode stuff and utilize things in a little bit of a quicker manner and be more efficient. We automated some things, but by and large, turning raw data into, I mean, that's just organizing raw data, right? Turning it into something that is operational that I can, use. It's done by staff and in a nitty-gritty format. I think what the chairman of the GOP was talking about then, my boss, was about the technology investments in voter contact and the data infrastructure, which is, if you look at the pie of the RNC budget, much larger than anything I was involved in. That was the huge investment. That was, in my view, far more consequential in helping us identify and drive out our voters.
Recently, South Korea appoints foreign affairs officials to monitor Mr. Trump's tweet. And it's highly possible that other countries will follow suit and will use some of the tweets to against Mr. Trump in his future policymaking or public statement. So I want to know, from your perspective, how vulnerable is Mr. Trump's tweet to other opposition research, the countries?
Well, I mean, it's his views, right? It's his views unvarnished, and it's it's president-elect and soon-to-be president articulating what he wants to articulate at any given moment. And just like I, as an opposition researcher, respond to the new ways in which folks communicate and get information, foreign governments are doing that with the incoming Trump administration. We'll see how it plays out.
Have you done opposition research on Trump to see what his vulnerabilities are so you can defend if you need to?
No, we've done nothing like that.
Thanks again for being here. The Democrats were obviously seeking a third straight term in the White House, which hadn't been done since FDR. So I was wondering if that gave you a major advantage in your Oppo research, having a Democrat in the office for the last 8 years, and if you foresee that being a difficult issue in 2020 with Democratic Oppo being able to operate after Trump being in the White House for 4 years.
Well, one thing that I didn't talk enough about was there were a lot of strong policy arguments. I mean, I think people have focused on, emails, have focused on the Clinton Foundation, the ethical stuff. We did as well. but the policy arguments were more bread and butter. You know, and you know, I personally think that in the last few weeks of the campaign, the most decisive issue, bringing Republicans home and bringing them out in larger numbers, were massive spikes in Obamacare premiums across the country. And you know, that wasn't the sexiest stuff, but I mean, that hits people in their pocketbooks, right? That matters. And the policy case, and people want change after so many years. I mean, holding the White House for 3 consecutive terms is difficult because people's priorities change, right? And swing voters' priorities change. And so, yeah, a level of fatigue with the administration. You had a candidate in Hillary Clinton who was not projecting any significant, you know, in big issue areas, policy changes. It was very much at the margins, if at all. And it was very much a continuity campaign, and I think she struggled as a result of that.
You said that one of the candidates that the RNC monitored was Jim Webb. Now, did you consider him a formidable candidate in the beginning? Something apparently the Democrats didn't. I mean, a distinguished military record, a good writer, a former Reaganite. Was he on your horizon as a potential?
I mean, candidly, he wasn't on our radar as somebody who was likely to be the nominee. It's sort of like, you know, if you you know, have say like a $5 million budget and you invest $4.95 million and then Hillary Clinton's nominee is not the nominee, then it's like, well, what were you doing, right? So it was more an insurance policy. We didn't really think that the party and how it's changed would be attracted to Jim Webb, but yeah, I think he's got a lot to sell and he's got a pretty impressive resume, and I would not be, you know, I would not have loved to run the campaign against him.
Your, I guess, current or soon-to-be current boss is coming into office with a lower than average approval rating. Do you see that as evidence of good work being done on the Democratic oppo side, or as reflective of other aspects? And as a follow-up, do you see him as especially vulnerable to oppo in the future?
Well, I think there's 2 questions there. You know, on his approval rating, you know, I do think a couple of things. I mean, he has tweeted to this effect. I don't think the entire gap between you know, his approval rating and other presidents assuming office would be entirely because of you know, polling irregularities, or not irregularities, methodology that's just wrong. But I mean, you know, the polling was dramatically off in the 2016 campaign throughout, and that's a whole separate conversation. But I'm not entirely sure that his approval rating is what public polling suggests. And the second piece is even more vulnerable to oppo. I really don't think so, because this guy's had the kitchen sink thrown at him, right? Everything. I mean, the Clinton campaign was a negative campaign, and they threw it all at him. You know, everybody is questioning his legitimacy now, I think rather unfairly, and certainly in an unprecedented manner. But you know, I think that he's had everything thrown at him, and I think the opposite might be true, that people have kind of seen him take on a lot, and you know, he may be a little bit more Teflon.
One more question.
The presidential debates, they used to be run by the League of Women Voters, which was a nonpartisan organization that researched the issues that people cared about, and then we had a debate about mainstream issues that led to less polarizing debates. In recent cycles, especially this cycle, we've had journalists who have become the issue in the campaign, whether it be in the WikiLeaks documents or in the public opinion polls after the debates. What do you see from your perspective doing op-ed with that stuff that needs to change, and what dialogue would start that process to create a more positive experience for everybody?
Well, I would, let me just say off the bat, I don't think the debates weren't successful. I think that they were highly successful. I thought that if you watch the debates, you know, I thought a lot of issues were discussed in a level of depth that you didn't see in other, you know, interviews and other interactions. They got record ratings. I think that was for a reason, because they were exciting, they were interesting. So I wouldn't go in there with that premise. And I also don't think that, I thought that, I have my opinion about specific anchors and specific questions and lines of questioning. But I mean, I thought that they asked tough questions, and I thought they got to the answers quite a bit in the debates. I'm generally not a critic of the process.
As we come to a close, I just wanted to ask a couple of quick questions to further contextualize your work, both as you move into the White House and the work you're doing at the RNC. So how many people worked on the RNC Oppo team, and what would be typical of a party as we are in the modern era now? What's that look like in practice?
Yeah, so there are a little over 30 folks who are in the RNC research department. There was an investigative team, there was a policy team, there was a team of folks that monitored the news all day. They're the worst job.
They're monitoring everything.
Yeah, monitoring everything. I mean, there's like TV set up. I mean, it's tough. And there was another team digesting it all, live events, tweets, social media, and telling us about opportunities. And it's a very chaotic, it's kind of organized chaos day to day. And this investigative team that's kind of walled off in the corner comes, reports to me a few days a week and tells me what's really happening, right? And the setup it's a little bit larger than we had in 2012, but I think the big benefit is that it was earlier, right? This stuff began in earnest in 2013, and it was much smaller in size and, with an outside group and, kind of incubated over time. But that's kind of, that I think was from an infrastructure perspective, the playbook.
And broadly speaking, for those of us who are following investigative reports that are coming through major media outlets, what percentage of those investigative reports over the course of a campaign might be fairly rooted in opposition research from either the parties or any of the multiple campaigns?
A lot. It certainly depends. I mean, there are a lot of times where we've FOIA'd something and we hand it to a news organization and they call up the people who run the FOIA office and say, hey, can we put up a identical request and get the same stuff, and they write the story. And then there are other situations where a story is developing and we're able to help in some fashion. I would say, I was in close contact with almost all the folks who wrote major investigative stories on Hillary Clinton or Clinton-related universe, on a pretty regular basis.
And then lastly, to contextualize the White House research operation, we should point out David Seamus had that similar job in the Obama administration before he was senior strategist. He's now coming to Chicago to run the Obama Foundation. I know that one of the things the Obama presidency did and other presidencies have done is, for instance, during the State of the Union address or other major speeches, they have groups of voters and citizens around the country doing dial testing, for instance. So tell us more what you're looking at, the kinds of research that an administration is trying to determine to understand the effectiveness of a policy, the messaging, and where a president stands.
Well, that's a complex question. And I would say that what David Seamus does, it's called research, and it's survey research, right? And it's getting feedback from voters. And, my bucket is sort of, kind of fact-driven communications research, right? And so there's sort of different buckets. And, my day-to-day will be determined on helping frame, first ground the White House message in facts, help to, build out the schedule and work with reporters on, rolling things out, finding our response to accusations coming from Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, congressional Democrats, those sorts of things. It's building out the message. So what he was doing, it's really a different practice, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time and what I know is extraordinarily busy time for you, about to get a lot busier here in a few days. Thank you so much for your time and the insights. We really appreciate it, Raj. Raj Shah, ladies and gentlemen.